So I want to tell you the story of my mother, Marguerite Sandoval. She loved cities very much, but they didn't particularly love her back. She was born in South Carolina and raised in Philadelphia, where she had me and my 4 siblings. We came from a family with a history of depression, and when my brother Jose got killed by a bus in 1976, he was 12, her depression exacerbated, and her mania became sort of impossible to contain. On one hand, she would be super quirky, and she was that lady who always had lipstick on her teeth and never took her wig off, and she would say, "God bless you," to all the strangers on the subway, much to my chagrin. But she also could be violently abusive and really erratic because she refused medication or therapy. There were charming aspects to her illness. On one hand, she lived in a fantasy world. In her fantasy world, she was going to build a Bible bookstore, and she was going to build a community garden, and maybe one day she would marry a man who looked just like Charles Bronson. In her real world, she was a single mother, poor and broken, commuting between these spaces that could neither contain her nor really help her. That sort of left room for all kinds of chaos to ensue. Like I said, sometimes she thought I was a genius. She would tell my kindergarten teacher that I had the IQ of a college student when I was 5, and then she might snap off the handle at no given notice and put her arms around me and choke me and tell me that she was going to kill me. My siblings survived by leaving, and I survived by writing, and through the grace of God. The World Health Organization estimates that there are 450 million people in the world with a mental illness. In poor countries, 80% of them go untreated. In rich countries like the US, that number is closer to 40%. And those numbers beg the question, what does a mentally healthy city even look like? How do we create spaces, especially in the globe's biggest cities, for those to have healing and caring if they have mental illness? And what do we do about people like my mom who resist therapy and medication? Those are my best guesses at grown-up questions. I mostly act like an adult now. I'm trained to be a journalist and a writer and have intellectual distance, interviewing experts on the phone, conducting research on the internet. As a little girl, I had really different questions. I wanted to know what was wrong with my mother. I wanted to know if we were going to survive whatever invisible thing seemed to be wrong with her. In her euphoria, which was most of the time a freedom that I experienced in her that very few women or little girls get to experience in their moms, she had no doubts about anything. She was going to win the lottery, she was going to be famous, it didn't matter. We were totally going to make it through. She also had this faith, which in bipolar people is a common bipolar trait. She could be really obsessive about her faith. If she wanted to, we would go to Mass every day, also much to my chagrin. But she had this belief that basically she didn't need medication because God would take care of her. And it's a belief that's shared by African Americans and a lot of other people. A 2007 World Health Organization survey showed that 63% of African Americans considered mental illness a personal weakness. And I knew that that wasn't true because I considered my mom one of the strongest people that I knew. Unfortunately, she had internalized this cultural stigma that exists in places all over the world. In rural India, in parts of rural India, mental illness is considered caused by evil spirits. And so one way to deal with that is by chaining them and beating the evil spirits out of them. 1 in 3 Somalis are considered mentally ill. Instead of treatment, again, they're chained to boulders. I understand that kind of fear and despair. I often felt it, particularly when my mother was really violently abusive. I understood why my mom was often left to her own devices, especially in a city like New York. On one hand, New York could be our most benevolent provider, and on the other hand, it could be our worst enemy. Visibility of mentally ill in cities often provokes a kind of fear and sort of a standoffishness. But in New York, when we were evicted, which happens a lot, we might have to wait 5 to 6 hours at an emergency assistance unit to get housing for the night. Welfare benefits were $200 every 2 weeks, which didn't go far in New York. And so we might have to rely on Catholic Charities for canned goods to get us through until the next paycheck. On the other hand, I might get free breakfast in the summers when school was out, and that would be my only meal of the day. Or I would get free transportation to and from whatever shelter we were living in. That was another way that the city was really benevolent for us. And, you know, people generally, I know people think of New Yorkers as being super mean, but actually, you know, people treated my mother with dignity and respect despite her mental illness. And in fact, the worst experience we had wasn't in a city at all, but it was in Chester. After my brother Jose got killed by a bus, my mother moved to the suburbs. So we lived in Chester for the first 5 years of my life. And Chester is outside of Philadelphia. Most families there in the suburbs, which are considered the heart of the American dream, had cars. But because we couldn't afford a car, we had to rely on public transportation. And often, without car fare to get into the core of the city, we would end up sort of languishing in the isolation of the suburbs. And it was a little bit nightmarish. Sometimes the lights would be off or the water would be off. And I think one of the things that people forget is the surprising truth about the visibility of the mentally ill in cities. One of the surprising things about seeing the most vulnerable in the cities is that there are real resources for them there. It's not just the density and public transportation, but there's also this sort of equal opportunity solace from the cultural vibrancy of a city that you find. And so I urge you to think about that the next time you see someone who's mentally ill in the city. Before you think of them as a problem, consider how both they and we are transformed by our witness of them in the city. You know, think of me and my mom, just two fragile souls trying to make it through the city with what little that we had. This is an imperfect system that we have for treating the mentally ill in cities. I'm here, and I made it, and that speaks volumes to what's possible through witness and transformation in cities. The privatization of public life is then not just an environmental issue, but it's also a mental health issue. In the 1950s, the wonder drug Thorazine really made a difference in terms of sparking deinstitutionalization. And that meant that psychiatric beds were no longer a place for the severely mentally ill to find themselves if they were having a crisis. One of the things that led to then was this social and economic crisis, not just for the mentally ill, but also for the poor and mentally ill. And that social and economic crisis was well underway when me and my mom moved to New York City in the 80s. A 1981 law made it possible for anyone, especially those who were mentally ill, to have a legal right to shelter. In 1982, there were 950 homeless families in New York City. By 1984, which was the year that we moved here, that number had risen to over 3,000. Because of my mom's inability to keep a job and pay rent, between the time I was 5 until I was a teenager, we lived in multiple welfare hotels, homeless shelters, halfway houses, and subsidized apartments. A lot of the housing for the poor back then was in the Bronx, which is where I grew up. Shout out to the Boogie Down. And that's where I really began to cling to this external world. It's where I fell in love with hip hop, listening to it, floating out of car windows. I remember the itchy wool blanket from the Roberto Clemente family shelter, which was the first place that we lived. And I remember I could tell when summer had come because the fire hydrants were wide open and the kids were outside playing, splashing around in their cut-off jeans when I was too hungry to join them. And there would be hundreds of thousands of families who would join our journey over time. Deinstitutionalization gave way to a process called trans-institutionalization, and that really led to homelessness and incarceration as a main substitute for mental health treatment on a large scale. we considered it dehumanizing, actually, because without anyone really treating my mom's underlying illness, she ultimately was caught in a vicious cycle, and I was caught in it with her. The main manifestation of that for me was hunger. So often, because we would be coming from Mass at St. Patrick's Cathedral, we'd have communion, and that would be our breakfast, and then we would walk out into the street in Manhattan and smell that burning salt smell of the pretzels, or that wonderful smell of the New York pizza, which always makes me hungry, even if I've just eaten. And that for me was really a tangible, it gave me a tangible sense of poverty as this kind of prison. What most people, and it didn't just impact us, I mean, there were other homeless families, and I think that when people think about homeless families, they think that it must not be too costly for them, but for taxpayers, it actually is. It costs taxpayers annually between $35,000 and $150,000 for homeless families to stay on the street. But with supportive housing, that number drops to between $15,000 and $25,000. The treatment of the mentally ill, or the lack of treatment for the mentally ill, has led to sort of a swelling of the jails and prisons. In 1980, there were about 500,000 people in state jails and prisons. By 2008, that number had skyrocketed to 2.3 million. Half of the people in state jails and prisons have psychosis, mania, or depression. And while this is an international crisis, 20% of the world's countries have no mental health policy or plan. And I've been astounded and heartbroken to learn that my mother's personal battles and our personal battles have really been experienced by other people all around the world. But I'm also really inspired to hear that there are ripples of change in a more humane direction. There are pilot programs in cities around the world that are beginning to treat the mentally ill not as cast-offs, but as real human beings. Houston recently became the first city to have a police division totally dedicated to the mentally ill. And so instead of criminalizing the mentally ill, they offer them real resources to get better. Supportive housing is still in short supply, but in places where there are pilot programs for the mentally ill, there is addiction counseling and peer group support that makes things a little bit easier. Because the visibility of the mentally ill has inspired this fear and loathing for so long, it's amazing to me to see that we can transform our fear with this kind of compassion that lets the mentally ill know that we see their humanity and that we're not willing to let them suffer alone. As for my mom, in 2011, she was diagnosed with terminal cancer. Her body was moored by pain and morphine. She used to brag about her Tina Turner legs, but they were made skinny by her cancer. She was still thinking about the Bible bookstore. I don't know about Charles Bronson. The day she left us, 6 days before I turned 34, she closed her eyes. People sat around her praying and singing sweetly. She raised her arms. She took her last breath. The rest of us would have to figure out what freedom would look like for women like us, and maybe women like her. But Marguerite was finally free. Thank you.